Good evening, everyone. My name is David Elwood, and I want to welcome you here to the Harvard Kennedy School and the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. It's a particularly wonderful evening tonight because we're going to be focusing on innovation, but innovation particularly in the context of social change in our cities. And it's really hard to come up with a topic that is either more timely or more important. But most excitingly, it's just about impossible to imagine a panel that has has been more successful in innovation, but is so entirely engaged in it even as we speak moving forward. So I want to just quickly welcome you. This is part of a set of activities that are going on this week. We have a public service week once each semester, and it really is in the heart of what we at the Kennedy School are all about with our basic motto, which is ask what you can do. And so we're thrilled to have such inspirational leaders here as a part of this, and very, very pleased to be part of this program. My job is real simple, is just to introduce, after thanking you, which that part's done, for being here, I want to introduce Steve Goldsmith, who's a professor here at the Kennedy School. He's the Dan Paul Professor of Government and the director of the Innovations in American Government program here at the Kennedy School. Prior to coming here, he had served in two terms as a mayor of Indianapolis, where he was known for his efforts to revitalize urban neighborhoods and transfer real authority to and receive national acclaim. In addition, he was someone who from the start was highly excited and engaged with ideas. Indeed, he came often to the Kennedy School. I personally had a chance to work with him on issues like welfare reform and other sorts of things. It didn't hurt him too much politically. I'm not sure how much he was able to wipe out the foolishness or add to the insights that we might have offered. He then served, by the way, as an advisor to the faith-based and nonprofit initiatives of George W. Bush, and for the past 10 years, he has served as the chair of the Corporation for National and Community Service, where he's helped lead a variety of efforts to expand and strengthen government service. He's also been here at the Kennedy School. He's worked with more than 100 social entrepreneurs, providing an innovative framework to leverage social innovation for transformative change. So one of the things he also does is he convenes what's called our executive session on transforming cities through civic entrepreneurship. And by the way, just last month published his latest book, The Power of Social Innovation. So it's his devotion to finding innovative ideas, his concern for the cities and towns, and most importantly, his unabided commitment to public service that makes Steve Goldsmith a terrific person to lead our efforts and discussion here tonight. Professor Goldsmith?
Thank you, Dean. Thanks, Dean. We're going to do this as a conversation, so I'm just going to moderate and interrupt. First, thanks to the Institute of Politics for sponsoring us. We have really just a terrifically, as David said, exciting group of social entrepreneurs. We've spent in the Ash Center the last couple of years with the Knight Foundation grant to convening leading social entrepreneurs and public officials around the country, some of whom are actually here to my left and your right. And their stories are exciting and encouraging, particularly in a time, I look at things kind of from the perspective of a mayor of an urban area. Life's not so great in many of our cities right now. Income disparities are greater, and high school graduation rates and the like don't look very good. Yet there are a lot of solutions, and the folks you'll be hearing from are part of those solutions. Let me introduce them very quickly, and then we'll carry on a conversation for a while and then answer your questions. To my left is Michele Jolin. She is the senior advisor on social innovation in the White House, responsible for many of the terrific activities of the Obama administration in the areas that we're talking about today, and we'll hear more from her. I should also confess, David introduced me as chairman of the Corporation House Community Service. In my volunteer job in that regard, I work for her, so I'll be very nice in my questions to Michele. To her left is Dr. Michael Lomax, terrific social innovator himself. One time had a county office in Fulton County, president of Dillard University in Atlanta, and now today with us as CEO and president of the United Negro College Fund and a terrific thinker. Mitch Landrieu, okay, now I just asked him how I should address him, because mayor-elect is really too many words, and lieutenant governor is too many words. So he's not quite yet mayor of New Orleans, but tonight we're just going to make him mayor of New Orleans. So Mayor Landrieu has a small challenge in front of him. He was, as lieutenant governor, as far as I know, the only public official in the country to have a social innovation office in his office, staffed by a Kennedy School graduate, and participated in our sessions and is thinking deeply about the relationship between government and civil society, nonprofit organizations as part of the path to rebuilding New Orleans. To his left is Linda Gibbs. Linda is a serial innovator, has won more innovation awards, I think, than anyone in various capacities in New York City, helped transform the approach to homelessness in New York City, is deputy mayor to Michael Bloomberg over social services. Is that close enough? And responsible for some many interesting ideas and programs as Mayor Bloomberg attempts to kind of look at the issues of poverty in New York City. So let me thank them all for being here and start with Michele is to my left. So could you describe a little bit? President Obama has been really out in front on this issue of social innovation, part of his past and the First Ladies, but you've got a little bit of money to spend. Could you tell folks what that's for and how you think you're going to make a difference with what sounds like a lot of money here, but it's not so much money in Washington?
Sure. First, if it's okay, I want to sort of ground President Obama's agenda in sort of a description of how we think about this and how we have put this together over the last year. As you all know, when President Obama took office, he talked about this as an all-hands-on-deck moment, that government needs to be more efficient, government needs to be more effective, more accountable, more transparent, but that the problems our nation was facing at that time in particular were so enormous that we couldn't do this alone, nor should government do it alone. So much of what is being learned in communities, solutions that are being developed, are really things that government should be learning from and should sort of figure out how to help spread when they're working and when they're having an impact. So we took that all-hands-on-deck moment mandate and translated that into an agenda for our particular office, the Office of Social Innovation, which is within the White House. And that has basically three parts to it. In thinking about sort of the all-hands-on-deck, engaging individuals, the first part of it is sort of the traditional service agenda, dramatically expanding AmeriCorps, engaging individuals in civic participation, understanding how to better use the energy, some of which was clear in the campaign, to help develop better solutions and faster progress on our problems. The second part of our agenda is around partnerships and how government can be a better, more effective partner. We see sort of a vast difference across agencies in the way that government partners with the private sector and the nonprofit sector. And there's many times when government shouldn't be doing government's limits, you come up against government's limits in the private sector and the nonprofit sector should be taking over, and sometimes agencies aren't particularly good at understanding that relationship, and so we're working on that. And then the third part, which is where I spend most of my time and have had an amazing year working on, is thinking about how government can create a better policy climate, better environment for innovation in the social sector. And a key part of that is exactly what Steve's alluding to, is the Social Innovation Fund that the president promised to create in the campaign. It was passed in the first 100 days, which was symbolic, as part of the Kennedy Serve America Act. And essentially, it's designed to find solutions that are working in communities across the country, help to get a better sense about what is working, what is working in that solution, and help move them to more communities of need. In the federal government context, it's $50 million, which is, as Steve said, is not an enormous amount for most of America. That is, of course, an enormous amount. But the key to this particular, the design of this particular program and this innovation is the leverage that we expect from the private sector and sort of the partnership that's built into the design. The federal government dollars are matched, need to be matched 3 to 1. They are being driven through intermediary organizations, many of which you've probably heard of, places. The selection process is happening now, so I won't give examples, but this was a recognition that the federal government needed support and needed to work with organizations who were good, like sort of venture capital firms, at finding and selecting the best ideas. So there's a number of parts of the design of the Social Innovation Fund that were very consciously put in to help learn from what's going on in the private sector, to partner with nonprofits, and to leverage resources outside of the federal government.
So let me bounce around here a little bit. So I have a government background, not a social innovation background. And so it seems to me that government is as often the problem as the solution, right? I'm talking about the extent to which, on a normative basis that you participate, but RFPs, prescriptive bids, lots of money for activities, often not too much in terms of performance. So Linda, the model of a social innovation fund, that to some extent Michelle's looked at, is your CEO fund that you run for Mayor Bloomberg. So it feels a little bit like you're using that money to test theories that you may use elsewhere. So my question is, last week New York Times said your cash transfer program was marginally successful and the mayor announced he wasn't going to do it. I read that and said, that's a success. He tested something and decided he wasn't going to do it. So talk a little bit about how you use venture capital, the same way Michele intends to do, and what's the risk of failure?
Well, the risk of failure is the kind of headline that you have in the New York Times, which has me particularly upset, because what the mayor did was he said, 4 years ago we put a poverty commission together, and what he asked the members to do, we actually took government, private sector, foundation, academic folks, put them all around the table, and he said, I want to know what the best new ideas are that have the potential of changing the trajectory of poverty, different from the results that all of our existing programs are giving us. And let's identify them, let's identify what the most important pockets of poverty that we need to work on, and let's try some new things. And the way we structured it was we actually put it in an office in City Hall that reports to me, and the budget is managed by that group, but it is programs run by all the city agencies in partnership. The vast majority of our work is done by nonprofits. And we wrapped it in very good evaluation, rare in the social services. And what he said is that he wanted to test new ideas, and he didn't want to just test proven things. We know that already. If it's proven, then we should just be scaling it up. This was an opportunity really to challenge ourselves to try new approaches. And so one of the things, probably the thing that got the most attention, was our conditional cash transfer program. Replication of an anti-poverty strategy that is in place in mostly very poor countries around the world, which is, it's a human capital development strategy. You pay incentives to households, mostly mothers, for engaging the household in activities related to improving their health and improving their education. And it's really shown quite impressive results in various countries, starting in Mexico 20 years ago. So let's try that in New York. And so this was probably the most controversial and different approach of the about 40 different initiatives that we took up. Random controlled design, a test group and a control group, the most rigorous evaluation. And we issued last week our first interim report on the first year and a half of a 3-year pilot. And the mayor got up, and we were all, here's the data, and here's all the backup. It worked here, here, and here, and it particularly showed very good results for high school students and pretty impressive improvements in terms of advancing grades, earning credits, taking regions, passing regions, improving attendance, sort of, stand up and, and take a look at that. On the other hand, it showed no results for elementary and middle school kids, and weak results on the health domain, and weak results on the workforce domain. And we just laid it out there. Next day in the New York Times, front page, not buried deep where most of our good news gets covered, but front page of the New York Times, disappointed mayor pulls plug on program. This was a planned 3-year pilot that is ending this year. So we didn't pull the plug, it just ended the term. And it's a little bit, I think, The challenge, so I think the good approach about this is that, of these initiatives, of the 40 or so, we've already retired almost, I would say probably 8 or 9 at this point. We've taken about 6 of them, and they were so successful that we've baselined them into the agency budget, so they're going to continue. And the rest, the jury is still out. So it's been a real laboratory to give a chance for sort of ideas that were perhaps too controversial for a commissioner or an agency to get going on its own. It's created a forum for those to come up and to be tested and evaluated. But I think the headline in the Times is a little bit of the political cost associated with taking risks, because even though you create all the dynamics to say that when you try things, not everything's going to work and some things are going to fail, and you have to create room for people to fail if you really want to encourage people to really test and try out new ideas. But the political risk for a mayor who is worried about a mayor-elect, it's only 29 days, and then you'll be in for this, is that the press can sometimes take it out of context and not show the kind of balanced, nuanced story that we presented.
So Mayor, let's make this a little more difficult.
Sure.
So post-Katrina, right, the faith-based and community-based service organizations performed heroically, and government not so much, right? And now you have a social innovation office in your lieutenant governor's office. Now you're going to become mayor. How do you think that office will work, and why wouldn't the social service innovators, who seem to do pretty well despite you, how are you going to make them feel good about your participation, right? What are you going to do that encourages them, and what should they worry about if they get too close to you?
Well, the first thing to remember is that post-Katrina primarily, there were amazing things that happened on the ground. There was an absent government for a long period of time, and individuals who I'd self-identified as members of the faith-based community, or individuals that self-identified as members of the service community. I see Michael and all my city year folks sitting out there. Went and did fantastic things. And so I looked at that and said, well, what is that? How do you define that? How do you put that in a bottle? And really, what is government's role? And one of the issues that I know the White House is dealing with and we're dealing with is, what is the government's role, if any? Should the government just get out of the way? Should it be private sector driven, public sector, third way driven, or how do you do that? And so when we developed the office in the Lieutenant Governor's office, we were very sensitive about not trying to go in and make it a government solution. And the best arrangement that we thought that worked was one where we facilitated the gathering of everybody that had self-identified as a social entrepreneur, a volunteer, so they could see each other and talk about what it is that they were done. Introduce them to each other and let them know what we saw around the state, figuring that if they were doing the same thing, maybe if they got together, they could find a way to leverage their assets and put it on the ground. So we basically became the convenor. Now, not surprisingly, everybody in government knows this, that everybody that considers themselves to be an entrepreneur eventually comes back to the government and says, I need some money, which gets you more closer to the traditional model. And I have to say that right now, in the birth of social entrepreneurship, we're in kind of this 2 or 3 year, birth of what does it really mean, and where does government begin and where does it end. So I'm going to try to take the work that we did in the Lieutenant Governor's office, transfer it to the Mayor's office in New Orleans, which means it's going to be closer to the ground. Take all of the people that we identified. For example, we created, with Michael's help and Alan's help, a city year program in 6 months. My friend Raymond Jetson's here, I served in the legislature with, who was on the Serve Commission in Louisiana, and we did it in 6 months in Louisiana, and it is now, we have 2 of them operating, one in Baton Rouge and one in New Orleans. We're going to continue to push that hard through the school system that, as you know, is being recreated in the city of New Orleans. And we're going to try to do it in a constructive way from an advocacy point of view for City Year. We're also going to continue to work with the faith-based community. You'll hear about a group called Cafe Reconcile, which was really a workforce training program that was started by a Jesuit priest and turned over to another guy named Craig Cuccia, whose only calling card was that he knew how to teach kids how to renovate buildings. And so he took the kids out of the neighborhood and he started teaching them how to renovate the building. And once a building was renovated, he said, well, what am I going to do now? And so he said, what does New Orleans need, and what do these kids need? He said, well, they have a great cultural sector. Maybe we can teach these kids how to wait tables. And they said, well, wait a minute, I'm going to teach them how to wait tables. Why not teach them how to run the restaurant? So they actually created a restaurant. And now these kids run the restaurant, and it can sustain itself over time. But he needs a little bit of help, too. how much help does he need? That gets into the innovation fund. This would be a great, for you would go, say, I'd like to give you some incentive. And again, I think the issue is going to be, where does government step in? Where does it step out? What's its really role? Is it one of just convening? And then at the end of the day, if something can't sustain itself, how does it really get the funding to sustain itself over time, and what's the appropriate level? And I think that's going to be the challenge going forward that, quite frankly, we don't know the answer to, and it may change from city to city, or it may change from program to program. But we're going to explore that. And just one final note, I think having the ability to fail is really important. And I guess that's going to fall on mayors to say, are you willing to take a hit publicly with the press saying, well, this was a failed program? And if you are, then I think that the innovation will continue. I think as soon as you get afraid, of it making you look bad and saying, well, we're not going to try it, when it gets to be a bad thing rather than a good thing to innovate, then I think we're all in trouble.
I can tell you're going to be a great mayor because you're already lobbying the federal government for money even before you've taken office. It was very subtle, but it was yeah.
I'm just saying.
Michael, let me try a couple different questions. You're interesting because of your background, but you're also interesting because you run a legacy institution of great reputation, and you're on the board of the high-performing social innovators, KIP, TFA, New Profit, and the like. So I want to do this. I want to follow this line of discussion about what you're worried about and what government can do. But first, before I met you, I was thinking social innovation meant TFA or startup or relatively new. And give me your thoughts about whether that you did privately, about why I was wrong in that regard, and how legacy institutions can be innovative as well.
Well, I think too often you are right that legacy institutions are calcified and stodgy and not innovative. And they're big organizations, and they're more concerned very often in just sustaining and keeping on. But organizations like United Negro College Fund, if you scratch beneath the surface, there is an entrepreneurial foundation. And I would argue that Frederick Douglass Patterson, who was the founder of UNCF in 1944 at the end of World War II, who felt that African Americans returning from the war, defending a democracy that did not embrace them, would come back and need educational opportunity as their ladder to greater opportunity within the society. And he created an organization which over 60 plus years has raised over almost $4 billion and helped over 350,000 people get a college education. I consider those pretty substantial results, and it was his idea that led that. And I believe that our organizations are critical to the success of the social entrepreneurs. So my worry, this is my buddy right here. I mean, I've lived in New Orleans. He is a risk taker and maybe a little crazy to run. And I ran for mayor of Atlanta twice and lost, and I'm just glad somebody who's run and lost had the courage to go back and run and win. And I hope that he's going to be a great success. But I think my worry for the mayor is that New Orleans' appetite for innovation may not be as great, and that the forces of the status quo ante, I think that's the right term, are going to come back and say, really hasn't been that successful. We need to go back to, and when they undermine it, it's not like it'll be replaced with other innovation. It'll be business as usual. Extraordinary things have happened in New Orleans. Education, the charter schools, not all of them which have been great, but when I go into a Mid-Sydney KIP academy and see a kid who walks up to me and says, I want to go to MIT and study game theory, I figure something's going on there that wasn't going on before.
Absolutely.
And my worry is that these innovations won't have rooted. that others will come in and undermine them and say, go back to the old ways. And I think the role of the legacy organizations, UNCF, is to go in and validate and say, this is, if you want your kid to go to college and you believe that I'm here to help your kid go to college, let me tell you, I want your kid to be college ready, and it's going to take the innovators at KIPP. It's going to take those charter schools. It's going to take those Teach for America core members. It's going to take these disruptors to make sure that your kid is college ready. And so the legacy organizations can do that. And the other thing that needs to happen is that we need to give cover to these courageous elected officials. And the cover is not social innovators. It's actually the people in the communities whose lives are being changed, organizing and standing up and saying, we're not going to go back to the way things were before. And I think that's a big challenge that mayors in New Orleans and Washington and Newark are going to have happen if they're going to be, if we're going to institutionalize, maybe a bad word, the innovations which have occurred.
That's more easily said than done. The people who are against change know who they are, and the people who are for change need to be led by the mayor or led by a neighborhood activist or something to create the dynamic for change, right? Mitch?
Well, let me see if I can, we're going to get into some sensitive subjects here, but I believe that we're going through a generational change in how we associate with each other and the things that we talk about. Now, I happen to live in the Deep South, and so race is always right below the surface, if not way above it and yelling loudly, depending on what meeting you're at and who you're speaking with. And so back in 1960, when Jimmy Davis basically blocked the school doors and wanted to take the schools over, that was viewed, and it was, as racial. So we jump forward now 46 years, and the state goes in again and takes over failing schools. And some people see that as a social justice issue as opposed to a failing educational issue that doesn't, create good outcomes for children. So as we move forward in a new generation with President Obama ascending to the presidency, and a generational divide between people like my father, who was a civil rights activist, and John Lewis and many people who marched on social justice against states' rights, et cetera, et cetera. We now find ourselves in the vortex of transferring into having to find a new way to educate kids. And sometimes people confuse the two issues. Hence, what Dr. Lomax is talking about in community meetings in New Orleans, in two separate rooms, the old Orleans Parish School Board room, which still exists, the issues about social justice, and down the street when the issue is charter schools, both African-American rooms, by the way, the issue is student outcomes. How much better are kids doing because city year folks are working there in enrichment programs in the afternoon? And I think Dr. Lomax is right. If you've ever seen a mother or a father see that child doing better than they ever thought that they would do, they are the ones that eventually will win the day from the ground. It will not come from the top up. Now, it is true that a mayor needs cover from other individuals to say, you can continue to be strong enough to support this progress, but eventually it has to come from the neighborhood. It has to come from the parent. It has to come from the uncle and the aunt who will say that this isn't about that. Now it's about my child going to college. That is what will eventually win the day. And creating that social space so that conversation can take place and win will be the thing that eventually succeeds, I think.
So let me ask a couple of different questions, and we'll get back to Michelle. You have time to think about whether you're going to give him the money he asked for. But, Linda, to you and Michael, so this is a public policy school, right? So when we're thinking a lot about here, we've been talking a little bit about is kind of the delivery system for innovation, but there's also policy innovation, right? And I think having you and Dr. Lomax talk just a little bit about how you redefine the policies of your organizations. You with respect to homelessness, and Dr. Lomax with respect to your kind of interesting story about stretching the mission of the United Negro College Fund are really fascinating ways to think about social change. So could you explain that?
And it's interesting, part of my reaction as I was hearing this conversation is to really reflect that there's no one template for change. I think change and leadership can come from many different forms. And so I was thinking about my experience the first term of the Bloomberg administration. I was the commissioner of our homeless services agency. And I came in as not an outsider from government, but an outsider to the homeless delivery system. And I'm really, really taken aback by the prevailing culture at the agency where both a very disempowered public management, I think primarily the result of 25 years of class action litigation where the litigants, the plaintiffs and the judge had disempowered the agencies so that they didn't have a sense of a control as if they actually had a role in defining the agency policy. And a prevailing culture at the nonprofit organizations who provided shelter, that shelter was the solution. That it was a big, ugly, difficult world out there, and that when a family, a mom with her young kids came into shelter, this was the safe place for her. And that, and you know, so you can feel that, I mean, all the positive motivations that might be the case, but they were more focused on why people should be in shelter for longer until we sort of fix up every little thing that could be challenging them before we let them back out into the world where they're probably going to fail and they're going to be back to us soon. And I was really struck by this, and I think because, you know, sort of, you know, fresh eyes and ears to some very long-standing relationships, and so struck that there was no conversation about solving homelessness. What was, you know, what were the core causes of homelessness, and how were we going to garner all of our resources to overcome homelessness? And by the way, the providers of shelter were the amicus on the litigation suing the city. So the people that I was, you know, spending hundreds of millions of dollars in service contracts to were also, you know, suing me. And so I'm like, oh, hi, partner, you know, let's, how are we going to do this? And so, and the way that eventually, you know, we were able to, I think, fundamentally change the conversation in New York was a series of conversations that caused people to go back and to recognize the common values they had. So the agency managers, you know, it's, you know, people in the Department of Homeless Services were really strong managers who cared deeply about the work that they were doing, but felt disempowered. The shelter providers, you know, cared deeply, but had, you know, were caught up in this litigation and thinking government's the problem and we've got to like stand up to make sure that they don't oppress the families coming in. And, you know, lots of jockeying for control. The way that the conversation shifted and the service delivery model shifted was when we were able to actually talk about why are we in this work to begin with, what is it that brings us to work every day? Is it that you want people to be happy in your shelter? No, you don't want them to be homeless. And so by starting the conversation or moving the conversation to those shared values, it was actually the leadership, sort of the top, not a grassroots movement up. That was actually was the way that I'm smiling because I'm remembering this one situation. Part of the arguments that the nonprofit leaders had around shelter management was around what we call client responsibility. You know, again on this, you know, these are really the weakest of the weak, the least able of our families. You can't really hold them accountable for things they don't achieve. But I thought that was, you know, one of the important lessons of welfare reform is that if you have a structure that provides government benefits but then balances it with responsibility, it can be made to work. This was going right to court, and all of my executive directors of the nonprofits were going to testify against me. But I was doing the rounds at the shelter, and the lead nonprofit leader who was going to testify against me, I happened to be at one of his shelters, and his shelter director, as she's giving me a tour, she says, well, you know, don't tell the boss, but I really think we need a little bit more leverage with these families because otherwise they just won't listen to us, and they know that there's no consequence, so they won't do anything. And it was a moment, too, that I saw that the executive directors of the nonprofits were out of touch with the front line of the service. And so it was, you know, sort of trying to, you know, have people listen to their own organizations. For me, the realization that they weren't the be-all and end-all about how service providers thought around, you know, what the best measure of service is. But ultimately, just having a place where people focused more on the core values that they shared in common and then structure a program that delivers it in that way. A different form of leadership.
We got a couple quick answers and we'll go to the audience. Did you want to comment on that? Or you just, okay. So, Michael, so Linda kind of changed put words in her mouth, the policy orientation of the agency from shelter care to preventing homelessness, right? It seems obvious, but it hadn't happened before her. Just a minute or two about how you thought about this with respect to the mission of the United Negro College Fund, your issue.
So we're founded 66 years ago with the notion that the barrier to getting a college education is really financial and to some extent access. Are there institutions that can receive them, and then does the individual have the financial resources? 66 years later, when a college education is even more important than it was at the end of World War II, if you look at low-income kids of color, they have a 1 in 10 chance of graduating from high school, graduating from college, graduating from high school, college. Whereas an equivalent higher socioeconomic non-kid of color has a 75% chance. What are the barriers 66 years later? Well, there's still some financial barriers. But the big barrier, the big new barrier, is college readiness, academic readiness. And so what we decided at UNCF is if our vision is a nation in which all kids have an equal opportunity to a college education, if that's the vision of America that we have, then we can't wait until they get to the 12th grade or the first year of college to intervene in their lives. And we believe that we have to impact that, we've got to start influencing much earlier on. And that's been the big change at UNCF, so that we're not just there to support a group of historically black colleges, we're not just there to be the nation's #1 scholarship provider for kids of color, and we are, and we're happy to do that, and we think scholarships are important. But if we really want to move the needle, we've got to influence what happens in every public school system across this nation, so that kids, low-income kids of color, are academically and in other ways, because they've got to have a sense of ambition and vision about their own lives, but academically ready. So that's why we've chosen to work with social innovators. That's why we've said we're going to support the KIPP academies and the other high-performing charters, because these are the public schools that are showing us the way to take the kids that we want to be able to support in going to college, how to get them academically prepared. That's why we're supporting Teach for America, because we see those core members going into classrooms and that their single focus is how they move the performance level of the kids in that classroom. So that's been our big change. I think we have a very important role to play in that space, because what I worry about with the social innovators is that they're not deeply rooted in the communities in which they serve, and that they're doing great work, so busy doing that work that they're not building the strong base of support in those communities that will ensure that, when fashions change, they're still there, able to do that work with strong support, and that they're having more impact. And that's why I think the program that Michele is leading, where they're going to be testing more of this, demonstrating more of this across the country, and giving other communities the opportunity to see the impact that social innovators can have, is another way of ensuring that, that this isn't just the social approach du jour.
So, quick question, Michele, and if you want to ask a question, just go to the mic, please. So your boss has a pretty big platform and megaphone. So what other levers will you utilize in his behalf to change the way government approaches social progress and transformation? So, will you take the 2.0 tools from the campaign and use them to create the demand that Michael and Mitch talked about, or what other levers and tools are you going to utilize?
Well, I want to answer the question, but I want to first say that in listening to this panel, I just wanted to put a very fine point on the fact that everybody's talking about results and everybody's talking about impact, and that at the core of what we're talking about with social innovation is how to make better, faster, more lasting progress on social problems that we all care about, that we all are frustrated that are not, that there aren't solutions to, and that federal government resources, state government resources, and local government resources have been directed at, and we aren't seeing the progress we need. And so it's trying to find better, lasting solutions. So I think, just putting a fine point on that we're talking about results, we're talking about impact. At the same time, when we talk about risk and government taking a risk versus, government being, taxpayer dollars, there's sort of an accountability that government has and how taxpayer dollars are used. There's this constant tension within government on those two fronts. And I think, what Linda has described and some of the work that she's done in terms of taking risks, calculated risks, things that have been tested elsewhere and that seem to show promise, but then drilling down and focusing on what is it about this that works, and how can we take what works and help spread it elsewhere, and then improve what doesn't seem to be working. And I think that's a really important way the government needs to think about how it takes these risks and how it focuses on innovation. So in thinking about your question, there's a number of different ways that we've been thinking about innovation and focusing on what works and moving what works to more communities of need. Some of it is taking the lessons from the Social Innovation Fund, from the Race to the Top, from the I3 Fund, which are in education, and helping develop a model for sort of these kinds of innovation funds. Not a cookie cutter sort of one size fits all, but working with agencies that, in the context that they're in, with the their own political constraints, and encouraging them to adopt some of these principles in some of their core areas where they're stuck most of all, and using some of the things we've learned about I3 and Social Innovation Fund and Race to the Top to drive change. And there's starting to be a lot of energy behind that, given the excitement and the potential of the Social Innovation Fund, and the excitement and the potential around Race to the Top and I3. So that's one lever. We're thinking of other things too around potentially using prizes and tools like that as ways to kind of challenge communities, again, where we're especially stuck, and government knows that it doesn't have the answers, and we're not seeing the progress we want to see. So challenging communities to come up with solutions, and again, using partnerships and sort of public-private partnerships as a model to drive change when there's better partnerships between the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, I'm reasonably confident that all of you are going to succeed with innovation. I'm less confident that the mayor will change the way his council appropriates, or the president will change Congress, so that performance actually drives changes in existing funding. So if you could get that done.
But it's sort of like, well, why wouldn't you fund what works? I mean, I know that seems like, but
that's a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. But I actually do think there is increasingly an appetite. And as we've talked to the appropriators in Congress about this Social Innovation Fund tool, which is relatively small in the federal government context, it was the moment when we started saying, this is a better way for you to have a better sense of what's working, and what if we can find these innovations, drive resources toward them to get a better sense of to build the proof points and the evidence around these, and then if they're working, bring them to other communities. There was this energy and excitement about it being a tool that they too could. And there's always going to be challenges and moving resources away from things that have always been funded and always will be funded. But I think increasingly this will put pressure on that, because if we show something's working, then why not fund what works?
Hope you're right. The mayor has a rebuttal here.
Not really a rebuttal, just in addition to what all of the other panelists have said, just to focus in on what the kernel of what Dr. Lomax said was. He basically said, listen, for years we've been trying to solve a problem a certain way. But we took a fresh look at what the problem was, and we found out that the problem had changed. And so we wanted to try to find another way to solve an old problem. That really is the root and the essence of what I think most people would say social entrepreneurship is. When Raymond and I were in the legislature together, and this has happened all across America, and it's worse in Washington, D.C., is the country gets locked into these ideological battles, and they're fairly one-dimensional. Should government be big or should government be small? Should it be private sector or should it be public sector? The field of social entrepreneurship basically says, listen, We got to figure out what the problem is, and we have to find a solution to it. And whatever that solution requires, however many different parts, faith-based, but we got to put them all together, introduce them to each other, and then fix the problem, and then hope somebody sees it, and then can fund it over a period of time. I believe, I'll predict to you that in New Orleans, for example, we will have a good body of evidence on whether or not charter schools and TFA slots and slots that are funded through community service through city year are changing outcomes. And I'll predict to you that after 4 or 5 years of hardcore data that shows that kids are reading at earlier ages and they're reading at higher levels, and more children are going to college, that you're going to have the kind of evidence that the president will need to go to Congress and say you should double the amount of money that you're putting in the pot that creates the slots for the individuals who on the ground aren't going to improve schools. Well, what happens is all of us get elected for 4-year cycles, or 8 if we're lucky. And if you don't have term limits in some jurisdictions around the country, you may get there longer. To wait for that body of evidence is really hard to do, and you know, as you know, requires discipline. But back to the issue of, you know, can you fail and still succeed over a long period of time? We have to be tenacious enough, and as Michael said, create groundswells of support amongst parents to be able to go to the city council members, the state legislatures, and even Congress and say, we're demanding that the public funds that we use go in a certain direction. And then on top of that, and this is the last point that I'll make, it is maybe the president's bully pulpit that would get Wall Street or hedge fund managers to peel off 1/100% to help go into a social innovation fund that would be partnered with the amount of money that the president's putting in, so that you have public sector and private sector money moving towards, you know, the common good. Now that would be a great dream if it was realized, because I don't think that the Congress is going to appropriate, let's say, $2 billion for a social innovation fund. I think they'll start off with $50 million, and if after a year or two they'd be better, maybe it'll go to 100, maybe it'll go to 150. But the 3-to-1 leverage that Michelle's talking about may help, but where's it going to come from? It's got to come from the private sector. And we have to find a way to incent not only the foundations, but the real private sector, the money-making guys, to say, I'd rather spend my money on something that's good as opposed to what's going to make a profit.
So,
If I could just add one little point.
real quickly, these two folks have been standing
I
there
know,
for a long time.
all right. But just at some point, good policy has got to turn into good politics. And, you know, this stuff is wonderful. It can have results, but that will be precious if it doesn't get rooted into a political movement that says this has got to be the way things are going. And I just think that that's a missing ingredient in this social innovation movement, and there better be a movement that is going to really propel this and make it the way the country goes forward.
Thanks.
You know.
Yeah, we do have the fact now that he's asked for money in the first 4 years, and now he's asked for money in the second 4 years, right? I just want the record to reflect that that big guy behind you stood there for 10 minutes and then relinquished his place to you, which was very nice. So would you, just your name and a quick question, and that'd be terrific, and then we'll come over here, and then we'll go back to the gentleman behind you. Thank you.
Jewel Mullen. I'm an alum. I work at the State Department of Public Health here. And I really appreciate the comment about failure, because I'm trying to encourage my staff to fail sometimes. Part of what we're encountering is that for some of what we're talking about in cities and social innovation, we're really trying to encourage communities that haven't been involved to be involved before, in which case there really is no evidence to build upon. With that, because we do not want to be read about in the newspaper and we don't want to be misconstrued, we're having a hard time sometimes defining what the early indicators of success are, that something might be sustainable and that it's worth it to continue, particularly as the funding cycles dictate that budgets have to be cut further. So I'm really interested in knowing how each of, or any of you, would encourage us to influence our foundations and our legislators.
So let's do that. We got 3 questions, so maybe a couple of you can answer each question just instead of, that way we'll.
I think there's, maybe I'll jump in quick just on, you know, what counts as success. One school of thought is set your targets high because you don't know how far you can go. If you set them low and you could have gotten higher, you missed an opportunity. That's me. I set the targets high, and so, you know, I never quite get there. But, you know, a lot of, The other is, and I've seen this done actually with, in public health, in particular in New York City, is set more manageable targets where you're pretty sure you can get there, you have success, and then you build on that success. And also, I've seen great progress there. And probably the overachieve, underset, overachieve is probably politically a more prudent way to go if you want to protect your political leadership for whether or not they're achieving those goals. But I think, it may really vary by time and place and, sort of how big the goal, what the particular issue is, how far in left field it is, how much you need to sort of, galvanize movement and judge based on that. But I tend to fall in the set it high school.
So I'm just the moderator, so I can't really answer your question, but I'm going to anyway, with an example. So I'm all for performance management, right? I preach it, I do it, I loved it as mayor, and so I've been saying it. But now I'm chairman of a federal agency, and the president says we're going to hold you responsible for performance. And so my immediate reaction is, well, how, right? We make grants to 10,000 organizations, they each have a little part of the pie, and how are you going to hold any of them responsible? And social problems are too complex, and they operate into programs. He goes, well, wait a minute. Performance, remember performance. So now Michelle's telling me, when you do these programs to the folks who are in the room, Michael and City here, you have to have some sort of performance measure. Well, I'm all for it, but the process of picking this is very complicated, right? And like Mitch said, eventually I have enough evidence to prove something and repurpose the money, but we're not making 10-year grants, we're making 1, 2, and 3-year grants. So the challenge for the Corporation as Community Service in this regard from Michelle will be to find surrogates for performance, like reading at grade level in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade that are reasonably likely correlated to high school graduation. And so that we're somewhere between inputs and outcomes, right? And so this in particular in this social area, right, where there's just so many players and so many people touching the family, this is very complicated. So I don't know, maybe have I misstated what you told me to do?
No. And I think also thinking about sort of the stage of a development of an idea. And in the earlier stages, obviously there is going to be less evidence and sort of, that's the innovation stage, and sort of as an idea becomes more mature in an institution or organization, and potentially gets a much larger piece of the pie from the federal government, it should have more evidence that it works. And if it works, then the federal government should be funding it on a large scale, or the state or the local government. So I think thinking in terms of that spectrum as well of evidence, depending on the stage of the idea or the organization.
One of the early indicators, if people keep showing up and keep doing what you've asked them to do, it means you're doing all right. You may get to a point where people keep showing up and you're doing all right, but you don't have the money to deal with it. Then you get to a sustainability issue. But whether or not it's going to work, people generally know when something's succeeding for them. So like in Cafe Reconcile, for example, more kids kept showing up so that Craig Cuccia had more kids to train, and they liked it. And then they told their friends, and more kids, so it was good for them. And instead of choosing to hang out on the corner and deal drugs, they said, you know what, I got a better way. That's how he knew that it was working. They didn't just come to us on theory and said, I really want to help a kid. Can you help me help a kid? They showed me Michael Smith. And they said, this is Michael. He's the oldest of 10 kids. He came here to learn how to take care of his family. I ran into Michael the other day, amazingly enough. Saw him at Cafe Reconcile for the first time. He'd come off the street. He was the oldest of 10 children. I went to eat at a fancy restaurant in New Orleans, and Michael Smith came out and saw me, and he had to reintroduce himself. I said, Michael, what are you doing? He said, I'm the sous chef in this fantastic restaurant. That's a saved life. That's evidence that it works. And when other kids see Michael doing well, they want some of what he's got because they know it's good. And that's when it's not evidence-based, it's not a book, it's not a protocol like you would do in a cancer research consortium, but it's one life at a time, evidence that you're doing okay. That's what makes you want to just keep going until somebody else recognizes the good work that you're doing.
That was a compelling answer. You should be a politician.
You should.
Yes, sir. Your name and a question, please.
Yeah. So I'm Evan Hutchison. I'm a HKS MPA student, second year. And essentially, so to pick up on Mr. Lomax's point, maybe Deputy Mayor Landrieu and Mayor Landrieu and Deputy Mayor Gibbs can help me out on this. It's at what point would the state, especially with the state legislature, right? We're talking a lot about resources, and state legislatures can be a real blockade to resources. In terms of failing, my motto is dare to fail. I ran a campaign against Sheldon Silver in 2008 with Paul Newell, first challenge in 22 years. And large basis of that was that silver at the end of the day has cost us resources, has blocked what the city needs to do, particularly on congestion pricing, but also commuter tax. When do you start, and I remember Bloomberg said he may support a challenger, and that was bold, but nothing materialized. My candidate wasn't that great, don't get me wrong. But, you know, at what point do you feel you need to take on your own party? You need to take on the incumbents in the state legislature who are from the city but not representing the city in terms of getting the resources you need.
So who wants to give the first political answer here?
I'll answer the question to take a little bit of political
you.
heat off on you. I think that in its infant stages of a new program, it has to be an executive's pet project. For example, at least in Louisiana, the governor dictates the budget. Now, there's some legislative play that goes back and forth, and sometimes they take it out and they put it back in. But if the governor, at least in Louisiana, generally says, I want this funded, they can get it funded. So if it's a new, innovative way, the governor's the one that's got to set the program up. For example, in Louisiana, our governor, at this point in time, really wanted to do vouchers in New Orleans. So we have charter schools, we have vouchers, and we have the public school model. He knew it was going to cause a lot of problems, so he said, listen, I'm just going to do it on a pilot project, and I just want it to be $5 million. The legislature said, fine. We don't want to get in a fight with you about it. We may not agree with you, but it's not worth having a civil war over, and we don't want to get in an ideological battle. You can have your $5 million and see if it works. That's how that innovative program, at least from his perspective, got started in the city of New Orleans. And I would think that perhaps as it relates to city budget issues in New York, and maybe even in New Orleans, the mayor in their executive budget could say, I'm going to put some skin in the game, just like President Obama did with the $50 million pot. Now, I'm sure that they wanted more. I'm sure internally in his office, they said, well, we're fighting with all the other cabinet members. HUD wanted something, health wanted something, education wanted something, and social innovation wanted something. He said, look, that's the best that I could do right now, but that's your number. Go make it work. And the legislature probably said, or Congress, look, we don't want to fight about that. It's the president's initiative or it's the mayor's initiative. We'll leave it alone. But I agree with you. If you leave the innovation initiative to the legislature, it is more likely than not going to get pulled out of the budget unless an executive stands up and says, that's my pilot project and I really want to see if it works.
But it's interesting, in New York, they've had a controversy about opening up the number of charters that there can be in the state, and particularly an issue was about more charters in New York and particularly in Harlem. And you had one state senator who basically blocked it. And in spite of the fact that, and this is another New York Times article I'm reading, here there are a couple of hundred constituents in a committee room with him in Albany telling him, we want more charters in Harlem. Now, I think that elected official has done the political calculation. He said there may be 200 here, but there are a bunch of other interests that don't want these charters. And I think I can get reelected without the 200 here, but I probably can't achieve my other ambitions without the others who are standing in the way. We're going to know that social innovation has been embraced when the political calculus is different. And when that elected official says, there may be some strong interests that want to restrict the charters, but I've got 40,000 parents out here who've got kids either in charters or they're on the waiting list, and I better. We've got to figure out, there is, I'm going to be the broken record here, there's policy, there's innovation, and there's politics. And I think we've got to recognize that if we want to have these demonstrations that have proven their worth and their value, broadened and extended, we're going to have to find a way of building broad political support for them. And I don't think that this movement has figured out how to create that kind of a movement.
It's not unusual. You're just going to win in the marketplace of ideas. It's one of the oldest, solutions to democratic change, right? That's where you have to win the game. You can't just win it from the top. Dr. Lomax is exactly right. You don't scale this thing on the ground, create a political movement, then somebody will take it away from you. One United States Senator that has a prerogative of just stopping in that particular body, you can lose it unless you make it, politically really important to get done.
Okay, if your question is as good as your tenacity, it'll really be terrific. So,
Great smile, too.
Aloha, my name is Ari Cole, and I'm a native of Louisiana. My family has deep roots at Barksdale Air Force Base. And I want to say to the panel, thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. It's very broad and very edifying. But this is to the Lieutenant Governor and the future Mayor of New Orleans. Katrina decimated our state socially, and the Dutch have wonderful levee ideas. What is the progress in New Orleans in protecting New Orleans ports with innovations from the Dutch that are very good at dikes? I haven't heard much about it, but as a Louisiana person with extensive family down there, and thanks to your family for helping us, African Americans in Louisiana, your whole family, what are you going to do as the mayor to make sure that that city is safe when another Category 5 hurricane comes? Because I'm very worried about it because my family's down there.
Well, I'll try to keep this answer as short as it can be. But first of all, for you who are geographically challenged, he lives in North Louisiana, Shreveport. It's about 5 hours away from New Orleans, which is way down on the bottom. But right now, and I explained this a little bit earlier today, that we are losing 100 yards of coastal marshland every 30 minutes. And in a couple of years, New Orleans is going to be in Shreveport if we don't fix the problem. Now, this is an issue of national security and an issue of economic security. I don't think the public and nationally really fully understands this or comprehends this, and this fight's been going on since the Corps of Engineers existed, well before 1926 when the last major flood was in New Orleans. But you basically have a major American city. Oh, and by the way, we're not the #1 risk. Miami is. And by the way, we're not #2. New York is. And by the way, we're not #3. 85% of us live in coastal areas in this country. And everybody is at risk from disasters, from catastrophes. But in New Orleans, it's a little bit more acute for a couple of different reasons. First of all of you know about the Mississippi River. It is, the largest river that we have, and it moves imports and exports in and out of the United States of America. It comes right through New Orleans. That's why Thomas Jefferson bought the place, got a great deal, $15 million, right? They're 4 of the largest ports in the world that are in and around the city of New Orleans. The reason those ports exist is because the Mississippi River is leveed, high levees that are armored, that nothing can get through. Those are not the levees that broke. But because those levees are in place, all of the sediment that comes down from all of the United States of America goes off of the shelf and into the Gulf. It does not go into the marsh. Because it doesn't go into the marsh doesn't get replenished, and it starts to deteriorate. That's one reason. The second reason is if all of you are paying attention to what's going on in Washington, D.C. with cap and trade, whether we're going to drill or not drill, whether we're going to find alternative fuel sources, it's all about energy independence so that we don't have to fight wars over oil. Well, New Orleans, Louisiana, produces about 30 to 35% of all of the oil and gas that you use. We produce more for you than we buy from Saudi Arabia. And those marshes also protect the pipelines that move that oil and gas from the ground, through the rigs, all the way up. And if that marshland isn't replaced, then the nation's economic security and national security is going to be challenged. Your gas is going to go up high, and everything that you eat, drink, buy is going to get higher. And so this is really a matter of national concern. New Orleans got hurt because the levees broke. Katrina, the storm, is not the thing that destroyed New Orleans. What destroyed New Orleans is the federal levees that were designed by the Corps of Engineers did not withstand the strength of what it was. And so the Corps of Engineers has to build it back. Now, this is a multi-year, major billion-dollar issue. May range in the $100 billion scale. Right now, the Corps of Engineers is only building the levees back to Category 3 strength. Now, all of us know because of global warming and a lot of other things, storms are getting bigger, they're getting faster, they're more intense, they're going to come more frequently. And so we really have got to call upon Congress primarily to create the level of funding that's necessary to get us to that protection level. And the best protection level in the world has occurred in the Netherlands, which is what he has talked about. The Netherlands, a long time ago, back in 1956, had a major storm. They said, we got to do something. We can't fight the water because we can't beat it, so why don't we live with it? Basically was their philosophy, and they created dikes and dams and a bunch of other stuff. So the engineering is there, but the funding is not. And we continue to be in a perennial discussion with the Corps of Engineers and consequently the federal government about being able to resource the construction of it. And I'll end with this. In most other areas in the country, when you sever some raw material from the ground, money is collected as a result of that. and 50 cents goes to the federal government, and 50% stays in the place of origination, not in Louisiana, because Huey Long cut a really bad deal way, way back when, and Louisiana only got a nickel, and the federal government got 95 cents. And so really what we've asked, and Senator Landrieu has passed a piece of legislation which creates fair share legislation, which will allow in the year 2016 for us to receive 35 cents on the dollar, not 50 yet, which will help fund it, but we can't really wait, you know, that many years. And so we have a continual presence in Washington. I met with Joellen Darcy the other day, who's the head of the Corps of Engineers now. We've been working with the President's office, and we're all trying to get our brains around how this investment needs to be made and how quickly it needs to be made. Because if you don't, the city of New Orleans, as you know, it will probably cease to exist in the next 100 years. It will not, the land just will physically not be there. And so this is a matter of national concern that will continue to press. President Obama has, when he was a senator, came down and committed to it. As the president, he's been leaning very much forward on it. But as you know, the last year has been somewhat challenging for him, you know, and the rest of the country. But I feel fairly certain that he's going to address the issue with the Senate and the congressional delegation going forward.
Thank you. Last question up there.
Sorry.
Great. My name's Thaxton Lundy. I'm a first-year public policy student here at Kennedy, and my background is in charter schools in New York City. I'm really excited about this panel. Thanks for being here, and really intrigued by the whole idea of laboratories of innovation. And in my work in charter schools, you know, I think the idea was that we want to bring in lots of new ideas and lots of entrepreneurs and lots of new schools and sort of, as Dr. Lomax said, build from the ground up. I'm interested in the government's role in quality control and also in replication. So we talked a lot about, in our school, about how we find good ideas and then we try and make more schools and make more organizations that are doing this. But it seems like that with replication, you know, there are a lot of organic things that happen that you want to make sure you continue to grow and continue to push. So what role does government have in kind of fostering the innovation, but also, and pushing replication, but also making sure that the quality stays high?
Actually, this is such an encouraging question. You're a student of Mayor Williams and mine, and I really like that question. It shows you've been paying attention in class.
Exactly.
It's very exciting.
It taught me everything I know, so it works out.
Well, Michael, maybe you could close with the answer to that question.
Wow, that's a big question. The role, well, you know, it's interesting to see that one of the roles that government can play and that the Obama administration has played in the Department of Education with Race to the Top has been to say there are certain conditions that must precede whether we will make funding available to you, so that they did set some conditions, and I don't have them committed to memory, but that would enable, that what you had to have in place before you could even apply for Race to the Top funds. So they've used the carrot in that regard. I do think there's a big question, and this will happen in the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, whether there are going to be some real standards, high standards set, and some sticks. Now they've said, you know, civil rights is going to be one of them, and there's going to be a justice element here, and we're going to make sure that that high academics, rigorous academics are available to all kids, so that, you know, we're going to make sure, we're going to enforce whether advanced placement courses are accessible to low-income kids of color as well as to high-income kids out in the suburbs. But I do think that are we setting rigorous standards for not just the innovators, but also for the traditional public schools that are out there? At the end of the day, that's the real challenge. Are we producing college-ready kids in all of our schools, whether they're innovative charters or whether they're traditional public schools? Are all those kids getting the academic preparation that is required for them to be competitive in the 21st century, so that when they show up at whether it's a community college, a historically black college, or at a selective private institution in New England, that they are ready to take college credit courses from day one. And the reality of our public schools is that even the kids who make it through and get that high school diploma, that 60% of them are going to require some form of remediation when they show up at a college of their choice. And so the standards aren't there. We've got to raise the standards. We've got to enforce them. And it can't just be about incentives. It's got to be the regulatory role that government plays has got to be enforced with rigor.
So let me just close with about 60 seconds. Hope you share my excitement about what you hear and see. When we wrote this book about the power of social innovation, we talked about civic entrepreneurs because some of the entrepreneurs are social sector leaders like Michael and Gerald. Some of the entrepreneurs are entrepreneurial leaders of historic organizations. And some of the innovation can come from government, like it came from the Lieutenant Governor's office, came from the Mayor's office, came from Mayor Bloomberg's fund, or what President Obama is saying with respect to results in social innovation. So we study a lot of problems in urban areas, but the exciting thing is we have also a lot of solutions. If we can get people to pay attention to those solutions, there's hope for social progress. So please help me thank our panelists.